Well, welcome. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are in the world. Welcome to our latest webcast, our second of 2023. We're excited about this one. We're talking about accelerating aspiration, performance, and continuous improvement in GBS, shared services, and finance operations. So thank you for joining us. I know there's folks from around pretty much every continent in the world. It's very late for some of you and very early for others, so thank you. My name's Dan French. I'm the one on the left. I'm founder and CEO at Consider Solutions. I'm very pleased to have two special guests today. Naomi Secor, who's Global Managing Director at SSON Research Analytics. Welcome, Naomi.
Thanks, Dan.
And Steve Fox, who's the Process Excellence Leader here at Consider and is a former VP of Global Business Services at Thermo Fisher Scientific. So welcome, Steve.
Thanks, Dan. Great to be here.
So here's what we're here to cover. So I'm just going to do some brief introductions. I'm going to talk a little bit about aspirations, expectations, and performance, and what GBS leaders are telling us. And then I'm delighted to ask Naomi to talk us a little bit about the Shared Services and Outsourcing Network research and analytics capability, some of the work they've been doing in their metrics intelligence hub, and some benchmarking across GBS and shared services organizations worldwide, which is kind of exciting stuff. And then there's going to be a discussion between Naomi and Steve with his experience running global business services and shared service centers about how these metrics and benchmarks, how they help us and how do we use them for both performance measurement and performance improvement. And then I'm going to come back around and talk a little bit about how do we drive performance improvement? What are those foundational drivers? And of course, at the end, if we have time, we'd like to take some or respond to your questions. So as we go through this, if anything comes to mind, and I'm sure it will, because it's a pretty packed session, we've got 45 minutes with you. Anything comes to mind, you have any question, just tap it into the Q&A panel on the GoToWebinar interface, and we'll attempt to deal with it at the end of the session. If we don't have time to deal with it today, we will deal with it we'll respond to you by email. If you have any technical problems, do the same thing, and one of our team will get back to you. So that's what we're looking to cover. So starting off now, looking at the context, and I always think it's interesting to separate out what's demanded of us as professionals and what we aspire to as professionals, because they're slightly different things. And we all know what's expected of us by our leaders and stakeholders, but there's a kind of repeated kind of soundings that I take from GBS and shared services leaders about what as professionals do you aspire to as leaders of your organization. And this is pretty much how it turns out, and it hasn't changed a whole lot over the past 2 years. First one is to develop an enhanced reputation as a value creator as well as a cost reducer. Now, we all talk about this, and it's a critical thing because you can't cost reduce your way to success forever. At some point, you've got to do more than just get more efficient. So that's pretty key, and that's relevant to our discussion today. Second one is to become a center of excellence with the expertise to optimize and automate as well as operate. And we see that a lot. We see rapid response automation, all sorts of other ways of optimizing processes and technologies within GBS and shared services. It also raises a question about the relationship of GBS with the CIO, and some organizations on this call have merged the two organizations. Many are still separate. Third one is about getting this end-to-end connectivity, making end-to-end processes, being the catalyst for end-to-end processes. And in these discussions, we talk a lot about ownership, championing, collaboration, alignment. So for the purposes of simplicity, I'll call it end-to-end business process collaboration. But this is what GBS leaders aspire to be the catalyst for that, for the whole organization, be the kind of key point behind that. Fourth is being the enabler for digitized integrated processes, which obviously relates to the former point. And the fifth one is to become a talent pipeline for the entire business, which, as we'll talk later, kind of is a kind of lagging indicator, because if you do everything else right, I think your key people are going to be very popular across your business units and in HQ. So that's kind of interesting, and I hopefully some of that resonates with you. But we're talking about metrics, performance measures, KPIs, benchmarks, and we've got a kind of love affair with KPIs at the moment, and that's largely a good thing. But this is a little bit a light take on it. It's Tom Fishburne, who's got a cute sense of humor about all things business. And this is, I'm sure you've all been in this situation. You've got more KPIs you know what to do with, and as the cartoon implies, is not always as useful as it should be. But we're here to break through that. And I think the one perennial question with everything to do with measures is, what does good look like? And it sounds like a really easy question. And of course, it is an easy question, but it's just very hard to answer. In any business or in any process or in any value stream, what does good look like isn't simple. It's a complex, nuanced, interrelationship, balanced set of outcomes. And I think a lot of what we're going to talk about today brings us back to this. We have to understand what good looks like for us before we start measuring things. So with that, I'd like to introduce Naomi. Welcome. Are you going to talk to us a little bit about your Metrics Intelligence Hub and SSON Research Analytics as a capability, Naomi?
Yeah, I'd love to. Thank you for that introduction, Dan. Great to be here with you, Steve. And the context was very helpful. Certainly, we're going to dive deep into some of this. So, yes, today I'm going to spend just a couple of minutes taking you through some highlights from our 2023 State of the Industry Survey. You have a front row seat to this. We have not yet published the report. And this report is significant. Every year, more than 400 shared services GBS attendees do take this survey. We seek to understand where we are from an operating model standpoint, technology adoption, where we're prioritizing, and so forth. So I want to take you through just a couple of highlights today, and then we'll dive deeper into the performance in some of these areas. So here we're looking at how established is your GBS today. And we continue to see a progression in the maturity of the shared services model. I mean, in the last year, 30% of shared services said they've been in operation for at least 7 years. This year, that percentage has increased to 37%. And we still see nearly 40% of respondents are at the planning or early implementation stage. So a lot of room for growth, also sparing the maturity as we did some research around to whom do you report to, and we know that 60% of shared services organizations report into the C-suite, whether that be CFO or CEO and CIO in some cases, so major influence there. So here we look at the scope, and we see similar commitment to overall maturity in terms of scope of services offered, also in terms of geographic footprint, which we're going to get to. But 70% of shared services provide multi-function services, and operating models also reflect this trend. So, we see now more than 3/4 of our industry are multi-function or GBS. Predominantly, they serve multiple countries or regions. So let's look here at the operating model. So overall, the trend is consistently towards that multi-country approach. Only 16% of our respondents are serving one country. And this is compared to 31% 2 years ago, so significant. To some extent, one country model is unavoidable, right? Some of these countries can only be supported by this approach. Maybe that's because of strict regulations or language or other factors, but this is where we're at today. Yeah, so let's look at our strategic priorities. What did you tell us? So, service excellence comes in straight after cost. And this is an umbrella for, a broad array of measures we could talk all day about. But, excellence means being able to deliver successfully, yes, against our SLAs and our KPIs. But it also, implies a quality of service that confirms our level of maturity. So, beyond that, and significantly less important, according to this data, is value. This is very surprising. Dan talked about this at the very beginning. We do need to find that simultaneous balance of value creation and cost, which many shared services organizations are doing a good job. But we do see that, the focus is still predominantly transactional. Maybe the opportunities presented by some of the recent crisis has not been taken full advantage of. So this is a bit of an eyesore, but Dan will be sending these slides to everybody because it might be hard to see this. But I love this slide because it just, shows our sheer scope of services, and this list grows every year. So it's indisputable difference that, this year we have, many more processes in scope than we had in prior years. A year ago, P2P still topped the list, but it had just over half. And this year that segment has jumped to 69% offering P2P. We also see order to cash and record to report. So finance processes still lead, but let's also look and see that hire to retire, half are offering this to their enterprises. And then there's some other significant areas as you look below. So I think, this says it all. 87% are at end-to-end. And this is even a jump from last year, which was 81%. So, we know that shared services organizations heavily investing in global process ownership roles, GPOs, to drive process integration. And this is really good to see. So this is really interesting slide because we wanted to look more deeply about which of these processes do you operate these GPOs. And so the greatest use is within those top areas we had displayed before: procure to pay, record to report, order to cash is not far behind. And at least half of our shared services organizations questioned use GPOs for all three of these core financial processes. And hire to retire is just slightly below, they're at 46%. So they all plan to use GPOs. Also interesting is that, where GPOs do exist, they sit predominantly within shared services and GBS as opposed to the business. And so we're able to leverage that process expertise, technology investment, stakeholder relationships, etc. Yeah, so what we wanted to do now is move into some of the specific benchmarks. So some of you may be familiar with our top 20 most admired shared services organizations in the world. It's an extensive data study. Every year, organizations give us their data, and we decide on the top 20 most admired, and we make some of that information available to our subscribers in an aggregated format. And so let's go ahead and look at some of the results.
So thanks, Naomi. I'm going to kind of just introduce a couple of points on this, but that's really great to hear that there's a lot of alignment between the survey results and the straw polls we've been doing with GBS leaders. So Naomi and Steve are going to talk through these points, and we're going to break this down to two areas. There are we're going to talk through GBS-wide metrics, and we're going to talk about process-specific metrics. And this whole the whole research and analytics capability that Naomi's sharing here has a total of 123 metrics for GBS organizations. So very, very, very powerful. So these are the kind of cross GBS ones we're going to look at to start with, and which I think are self-evident. But I'm interested to hear Steve's point of view on these things as well. So over to you, Naomi.
Great. So there are two ways to get benchmarking data within SSON Research and Analytics if you are a subscriber. You're able to look at the top 20, which we're going to start with, this data set, and also you can look at our wider metric intelligence hub, and you're able to benchmark by industry and location. And this is a self-service tool, by the way. So here we're looking at top 20. Cost of finance function roles in your shared services center as a percentage of revenue. We always display for you the definition of the metric and the calculation where possible. The yellow represents the median. So Steve, you've got incredible experience running in-house GBS. I'm interested, what does this metric mean to you? Why is it important? And are these results shocking?
Yeah, so thanks, Naomi and Dan, for the intro here. So this is, if we all just keep in mind for this specific metric, right, what we're showing here, this is the top 20. So these are clearly GBSs and shared service organizations that are doing many, many, many things right. As you can see that, kind of less than 0.5% of cost relative to revenue is pretty impressive. And so one thing I just want to kind of level set everybody on with benchmarking is, it's great to look at. It's great to have this idea of kind of here's where we are, maybe a little bit, here's where we've been, and here's where we compare, and that's absolutely critical. But also, I leveraged data like this very specifically to influence, right? Influence the C-suite, influence, my direct manager, influence business unit leaders to say this is kind of where we need to go and why. And data like this, this kind of macro metric top line, I looked at this as kind of the C-suite intro to, hey, this is why it's important for us to go do X initiative, right? Bring in a new service or a new scope of services or a new business unit or a new geography into GBS. This was a great way to build some alignment and coalition around that idea.
So let's look at that same metric, but here we're in our metric intelligence hub. So for purposes of this, example, I've chosen manufacturing CPG in North America. So as we compare, Steve, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, you can see the numbers here a little bit, right? It's how the median is in that is a couple clicks higher. I love the fact that I could drill down not just to an industry that's specific to me or an industry I'm interested in, but also the geography, right? Because we all know there's differences, right? We all know there's differences from industry to industry, from geo to geo. And not only does this help relative to kind of me looking at my organization relative to others in my industry, but also being able to look at my GBS geography-wise from APAC to EMEA to the Americas, right? And really kind of know there's different requirements, maybe there's different technologies, there's different approaches from geography to geography within, like there was for me at Thermo. I had very different enabling technologies in some cases from geography to geography, and this helped me kind of get a sense for where I stack inside my own organization relative to the broader benchmarks that SSON offers.
So this one, employee net promoter score, very important. Experience management is certainly at the forefront. Our internal employees, the employees that we service, all of our stakeholders, how are we doing? How did you measure this at Thermo? Yeah. And what's your take on the top 20 here?
Yeah. I mean, this is so again, for those of us that are familiar with NPS, classically this is done from a customer perspective. But hey, in this day and age, right, employees are, as GBS leaders, some of are arguably some of our most important customers, and making sure they're engaged and promoting kind of where they are and what they're doing with us is critical. And so this shows that some really high scores relative to what a classic NPS is. If you look at the median here at 70 to 80, and one of the things I leverage this idea, whether it's classic NPS or whether we had employee involvement surveys. There's a lot of surveying that happens out there in different different organizations to just get a sense and get an idea of where your teams and employees' heads are. This is something I leveraged a couple times a year, right? There was always kind of one time a year, it's usually in the beginning of the year, call it that, kind of February timeframe, where we did this survey, we found out where our employees' heads were, where we needed to, where we were doing things right, and then where we needed to shore things up a bit. And then what we would do is put together a set of initiatives around kind of the top 3 areas that we wanted to focus on. But we didn't wait a whole year until next February to go assess how we're doing, because that becomes kind of a hit or miss. And I never wanted to be in this hit or miss. I wanted to understand where we were. So then I would do a kind of a mini survey, right? Kind of mid-year after I had the chance to let some of these initiatives take hold, communicate, put some actions in place, and then kind of really again then assess what we've done to kind of move the lever on certain, on these top 3 priorities. Is it working, or do we need to course correct? So this really helped me understand what the success of some of these initiatives we put in place were. So that kind of mid-year checkpoint was really important.
Great. So here, let's look at the topic of attrition. This is in our MIH, looking at chemicals in North America. Always lots of discussion around the topic of attrition, what's healthy level, what contributes to positive. So how did you tackle this?
Yeah. So I mean, we all know it's really competitive to get the best talent out there, right? And the last thing you want to do is go through that effort and that focus for you, your teams, your talent acquisition, team members to go, kind of get these people in place and find the best talent you can find, only to have them, kind of go through training, go through education. I always kind of talked about, by the time they figure out where the restrooms were and got through a quarter end cycle, I'd invested quite a bit of time and money in these folks, and I did not want them leaving, right? In this inside this 1 year. I mean, clearly you don't want them leaving at all if you can avoid it through development and promotion and the EIS things I talked about. But I would say here, the key on this to me always was, because you're going to have this, right? There's going to be attrition inside a year. It's going to happen. Is it 1%? Is it 5%? That's the, you got to play with what you have with what your tolerance is. Here is the key here. Exit interviews for these people, critical. If I had somebody leave within inside a year, that exit interview had to take place. I required it, and I needed to get the feedback because I needed to learn what happened, what were the main issues, what can I change going forward. It's critical to drive this this percentage down.
It's a great example. So let's look here at the total ICT cost per end user. Again, we're in the top 20 now.
Yeah, and this is a super interesting metric to me in benchmark, right? Because I think you gotta really be careful with something like this, because there could be some unintended consequences of how this moves. Whether, if you look at, I think everybody can probably see the legend at the bottom. You can move this thing out to the right, and you're looking at this and saying, oh, my cost per end user is increasing, and you say that inherently is that a good thing or a bad thing? And depending on your situation, moving to the right could be a very good thing, right? If you're able to invest wisely in enabling technologies or in any technology, and ultimately kind of the end user, you don't need as many end users, because whether it's more self-service, whether there's less issues to take care of, whether there's less people that need to use the technology because you've got automated workflow in place, etc. I think you really got to ask yourself when you're kind of making a decision on technology and deploying something, what am I looking to get done here? What's my end objective here? What does ultimately, as Dan mentioned, what does good look like? And I think we got to be careful with a metric like this, with being very kind of prescriptive on the front end of what you're actually looking to achieve, because you can very much have something that looks good in one way, but you're not getting the output on the other side. So I think there's a lot that needs to go into this, especially if you're embarking on a multi-year transformation, whether it's an ERP migration, etc. It's a key metric to start with, to know what your baseline is and understand kind of where you expect to take things.
And bad debt here is a percentage of total AR, critically important.
Yeah. At the end of the day, for me, right, this was my report card on how well my order to cash process worked. And because a lot of times this gets pushed away at the back at the end of the collection cycle and says, hey, you didn't collect and it's bad debt. Why didn't you collect? Well, there's a lot of things that go into that decision on the front end to even do business, right? Whether it's credit decision, payment terms, the way that service was delivered. A lot of times people look at the end all be all kind of AR metric or order to cash metric as DSO, and we're never going to get away from DSO, right? I mean, that's classic working capital accepted by pretty much everybody. There's a lot of variable in DSO. Hockey sticks for revenue can affect DSO. Payment terms, methods of payment can affect DSO, pretty significantly. So ultimately, at the end of the day, this was the metric that I looked to say how successful are we overall in managing new customers, order flow, and ultimately, obviously, the collection process.
Yeah, and let's talk about days to close. I know you have some great examples here for the group.
Yeah, I think we all, for those of us that have owned the close process and have been tasked with I'll say consolidating it or reducing the days to close, this can be taking a day out of close is a monumental task, and to me it really doesn't matter what organization you're part of and kind of how you view this. Taking a day out of close is a significant effort. A couple of things I looked at with this is, first of all, I would take the month-end close checklist, right, and scrutinize those lines and say, hey, where do I have dependencies on somebody else? is there an input to this task that I need that I can't be done by, you know, kind of day plus one, let's say, or day one? But if there weren't those dependencies, I moved as much of this as I could to day -1, day -2. If I could move something to day -5, right, like the week before close, that Monday, if you will, in kind of a 4-5-4 close cycle, I did that. And if I had some key dependencies that took me out to day 3 and day 4, we go talk to those folks. We kind of challenge that a little bit. If I was waiting on something from FP&A, or if I had to wait on an accrual from AP, it's like, hey, if I had to wait on a bad debt calc, they're like, hey, this isn't ready till day 3. I'm like, well, let's talk about why that is. Now, you know, getting this thing down to you know, these companies that are in that 1 to 3 day close, and I would guess, Mike, I would guess they're doing a lot of day -1, day -2 activities, or there's a lot of estimation going on, which, you know, in months 1 and 2 of a classic, you know, quarter close can be fine. But those are a little kind of a little bit of the approaches I took to this to try to minimize, or I say minimize, try to take a day out of close, which again, monumental task in some cases.
Well, thank you both so much for that. That's a pretty broad range we've looked at. We've looked at across the piece, just a few specific metrics. We've got some views, and now we're just going to dig a little deeper into one process. And we've chosen purchase to pay, but we could choose any others. But this is just one to kind of get some depth here. And we're going to look at these 6. And Steve, you're going to share your thoughts about these?
Yeah. So we'll pop through these relatively quickly. So this first item, I mean, this is really managing indirect spend, and I always think of it kind of managing that maverick spend. In some cases, people might think about this as managing maverick spend and tail spend. But I know there's a lot, you know, if you're out there kind of shopping, if you've ever shopped a little bit or tested the market on solutions to help control spend, there's always this promise of, hey, we can control maverick spend. We can get, you know, we can control 80% of your spend, right, with this tool, with this workflow, with this policy or process change, etc. If you look at the reality of it here, I know, you know, this is North America consumer packaging goods, you know, segment, right? But assuming this is relative, you know, this is a relevant, you know, metric for anyone. You look at, it's only 5% are controlling over 70%. So I think the thing to do here is baseline yourself, question, right? Where do I want to go? If I'm at 10%, maybe getting to 30% of controlled spend, if it's top suppliers or top, you know, or strategic or sole source suppliers, maybe that's good enough, and you're cool with that. But I use this as kind of just be leery, right, of the promises out there. So the next one we'll chat about is around exceptions, right? So, or around, exceptions. And I know, you know, exceptions, I refer to them as defects, process defects. They come in a lot of different forms for many of us, right? Is it manual entry? Is it some offline approval that's required around email or offline coding? Late goods receipts can be an exception and are an exception, or maybe like after the fact POs. But they, you know, this is an area I looked at to say, you know, I was really interested in what my exception rate was, of course, right? Kind of, you know, where do fingers have to touch keys and do things differently, or we have to go offline from the kind of the happy path, if you will. What I leveraged this for is I identified my top 3 exceptions, right? By effort on my team or impact on the end user. It was kind of both, and I usually had of these 3, I usually had 2 of them were kind of internally focused and how can I make things better for my team, and 1 was externally focused on the client experience or the customer experience. And so I leveraged just to kind of identify my top 3, and then let's go tackle those and make some progress and some headway on those. And then I think on this first time match rate, it's kind of similar. I think we hear first time match rate a lot. You know, what does it mean? You know, if we put in this enabling tech, you can get your first time match rate up from 10% to 80%. I leverage kind of benchmarking like this if you get specific to your industry and the geos you're interested in or that are relevant to you in your shared service or GBS org. This gives you a good comp, right? Gives you a place to look, gives you a place to kind of say, okay, hey, where is the median, or where are people kind of centered on first time match rate? And it was something I leveraged to help me gauge what's realistic, what can I expect, what should I question? Somebody's coming in flying high saying, hey, you put this thing in place, pick your geo in EMEA, I think we get your match rate up to 85, 90%. Like, well, you know what? I've got a lot of other companies that probably said that's not super realistic when I use data like this. So again, it's kind of that knowledge you keep in your hip pocket to question what's being put in front of you. Yeah. So this next was cost per invoice, and again, this is a specific drill down into construction in Western Europe. Like this is, for me, this kind of the classic lagging indicator, right, of how the AP process is working and flowing. And so I leverage this to help track policy process changes, right? Or if I did a pretty significant transformation and maybe moved a geography or a new business unit into GBS, I wanted to know what this was prior to moving, and then as I moved it in, I wanted to know what it was after that service had been migrated into shared services. But also, this is a great tool, like rolling out a new DOA, right? A new approval authority matrix to say, okay, if I'm changing these approval limits and the way the process works, how has that affected my cost per invoice? Am I able to process more invoices per FTE and just drive this cost per invoice down a little bit? Yeah, and here we dive again a little bit deeper into the AP cycle time, and just as a point of reference, I know it's hard to see, and for those of you that want these slides will be made available. But what this is looking at, this specific metric time frame, is from the receipt of the invoice, right, to when it's approved for payment. Because there's a lot of things that can go into cycle time if you go all the way to, a lot of times to go all the way to when the payment is issued. Obviously, payment terms get factored in there, which is a key differentiator, a key impact. But this was important to me. I wanted to get in. I wanted to make sure not only myself and my team, but groups like Treasury had visibility to my actual AP balance as quickly and as early as they could, as it goes to trying to forecast cash, understand accruals, obviously factor, things can be accrued, but if I had the actual invoice in the system, matched, approved, whatever it is, ready to go, I had a lot more confidence in my ability to forecast cash and really impact positively the way Treasury, if you're in a multi-currency, kind of environment, which many of us are, the ability to hedge currencies, critical, right, for our Treasury group. And the earlier they had visibility to the liability and the timing of that liability, really important to be able to give them that kind of extra, we all know, right, a day can make a lot of difference when you're looking to hedge currencies.
Thanks. Oh yeah, you got one more here.
I think there's one more. Yeah. So this is DPO, and again, I chatted a little bit about DSO, relative to bad debt. DPO again, it becomes kind of that a lot of times that most visible working capital metric coming out of AP. It's important. We're not going to get I don't think anybody's going to get away from having to kind of manage to a number and an expectation around DPO. But I think it's just important that we all understand industries have varying degrees of standard payment terms. Payment methods can affect DPO significantly. And so you got to keep all these kind of variables. I always try to keep these variables in mind when I'm explaining DPO and explaining the ability to hit a target or in the case that I didn't hit that target, or I had to explain why. And so again, DPO, key metric, the key working capital metric coming out of AP in a lot of organizations. Just understand there's a lot of variables that can affect that, and it is quite frankly, my experience and opinion is very easy to manage DPO. It's just what do your suppliers expect, and what does your internal, what does your C-suite expect on DPO?
Well, thank you, Steve. Thank you, Naomi. We've just looked through 12 different metrics here, and that's 12 out of 123. So we've done a little deep dive on those, but it's been really helpful to understand some perspectives there. I'm sure you got questions. As I said before, please pose your questions in the GoToWebinar interface. Get them while you think about them. Get them while they're hot. And even if we don't get time to do them all today, we will get back to you by email. So I'll just kind of try and round this out because there's some interesting observations out of here. obviously I talked earlier, we're in a kind of love affair with performance indicators right now. And as Steve's kind of alluded to, in fact, being quite specific in a few situations, that it's not always as obvious as it seems. And I'm a big lover of the Dunning-Kruger curve, this Dunning-Kruger effect, this idea that with any kind of problem, smart people with little experience of the specific domain will have massive degree of confidence in a decision or a plan or a strategy. And then when you actually have to execute it on their behalf, you get into the middle of this, and with more experience, you go, wow, this is way more complicated than I thought and was expected. And if you're fortunate enough to become a subject matter expert, you do become confident, but never as confident as you were as a naive optimist. Now, what's interesting about that is it also applies to performance measures and KPIs. So, Steve's talked about some of the things you've got to be careful about. It isn't always just, let's measure this and that's good news. You've got to think very carefully. And that relates to the whole question about what does good look like. That is one of the hardest questions in business. We assume it's easy, but it's not. What does good look like is a balanced scorecard, if you like, of outcomes for a particular stakeholder, customer, or process. And you've got to remember when you're looking at trying to drive improvement, the what's in it for me quotient. You can't change things without making the participants feel they want to participate in it. And this is continuous improvement, right? How do we get better and better, 1% a day? And that little 2 lighthouses at the bottom just reflects this point that, even with any one process, whether it's customer to cash or source to pay or whatever, you've got different kind of towers in your own organization who've got a different view of what good looks like. So maybe sourcing have a different view of what good looks like to treasury, but they both have a view on the same process. So these are some of the challenges we have to get really down to resolving and aligning. And Steve referred to defects. It's a critical thing. Those of you who've had any kind of educational experience with Lean Six Sigma will know all about defects, but you've got to be very careful of traditional sort of performance measures, as in how good are we. A number of times I have a conversation with a GBS leader or a CFO that say, all our KPIs are green. They're all reading green, but our customers are unhappy, our suppliers are unhappy, and our people are unhappy. What's going on? And the kind of standing joke is, well, that's it. You've got a watermelon KPI there. It's green on the outside, but red on the inside. So performance measures telling you how well you've done are of use, but they're of use just to say where I've got to, but they don't help you get better. So the criticality is to understand what are the defects in a process, and that's what really, really matters. And it's those defects that help you drive improvement to the performance. So don't spend all your time measuring lagging indicators. And this is that definition. So lagging indicators are what we typically focus on, how well am I doing, the performance. They're nice to report up the line and nice to maybe to benchmark. But if you want to improve, and that's the only reason really for doing any of this, is you need leading indicators. And those leading indicators are all about defects. And I'd say you want 3 leading indicators for every 1 lagging. So, you've really got to work out, as you would with a car, it's not just about what's on the dashboard, it's how's the engine working? Is the engine set up to support us for the journey ahead? And of course, when we talk about these outcomes, we're talking about outcomes of business processes. And we have yet another kind of Dunning-Kruger problem, is we all nod when we talk about the business process. But if you ask 10 different people in your own organization, or even 10 different stakeholders in a particular process, ask them, what do you mean by process? You will get 10 different answers, or possibly 12. And some people mean, the steps in the use of a system. Some people mean what's required to produce an outcome. There's a lot of different, we assume because we use the same word, we mean the same thing. I won't read through the slide, but you get the point here. It's not just steps, it's also habits and behaviors. It's also all the different activities that need to be performed to produce the outcome. It is about the experience, not just the mechanics. So, process itself is an interesting discussion. And we know in GBS and shared services that we're on the, we're typically on the right-hand side of any one of these processes, whether it's customer to cash or source to pay or whatever. We're focusing on the right-hand side, but 95% of the defects or the issues and the related effort that causes are set on the left. So, this kind of really gets us thinking about end-to-end processes. We've really got to get our head around end-to-end process, because we will not drive the improvement we need in the bit that we run if we don't really get the end-to-end working smoothly. And obviously, data is key. So we want to be able to report on those performance measures, but critically want to report on and use data-driven decision making for the defects. What are the defects looking like right now? How do we prioritize them? What has the biggest impact? What are we going to do to crack them to improve our performance? And just a kind of little point here, there's some received wisdom here, but there are some missing links. So the general view in the industry today is if I have a data lake of all of my available data of all of the systems, I can get some smart people to put some dashboards together, and they can use some tools to take that data and represent it, and that will address both our leading and lagging indicators in whatever user experience you want. But the challenge is, I come back to, these key business questions are much harder than people assume. So the data folks think the business people know what they are, and the business people think the data folks know how to answer them. This is the hardest part in any data-driven decision making around defects or about performance. So it's really critical to get your head around that. The next piece is about the semantics. What does the data actually mean? And then the third bit is how did that data get enriched to actually provide the support you want? Now, key business questions, you might be thinking about that. Does that make sense or not? And here's a light-hearted example, but it's so relevant. If you said to me, how many countries are there in the world? I'd say, I don't know, but I can Google it. Well, it turns out I can't. Well, I can, but I get 6 different equally accurate answers. And that's the point, they're all accurate. You look at that and you go, okay. And so what I do is I have to come back to you and say, I've done that work for you, but now I need to ask you, what did you really mean? What are you actually trying to find out about the countries in the world? Now, that's a kind of light-hearted example. You take that into, what revenue did we do last quarter? What was our, what invoices did we process last quarter? Whatever, or last week. Is it the invoices that we paid? Is it invoices that were first-time matched? Is it invoices that were accurate, we didn't have any issues with? There's a whole bunch of subtle questions, and they all relate to what problem you're trying to solve. So, hopefully that will give you some food for thought, but it's a critical thing when you're doing measures. So coming to a kind of a bit of a conclusion here, we've used Naomi's SSON Research and Analytics resource here. We looked at 12 measures of 123. It's a very, very powerful resource. So if you want to get access to that, get a subscription. Companies around the world are using this. It's very powerful. We use it. Talk to Naomi. I talked about the 123 metrics and benchmarks. That's kind of how they break down. It's very, very powerful stuff, as Steve was referred to. And that's one thing you can get out of this. The other thing you get out of it is we've got this end-to-end process thinking and alignment playbook, which relates to this point that you cannot improve your part of the process if you do not get your hands and head around the end-to-end piece. So that's something that you can get access to. So that's what we talked through. Hope you found it useful. We've got some questions. We've got a couple of minutes for the questions, so I'll do the questions now. If you've got questions, and some of you put questions into GoToWebinar, we'll deal with a couple of those now. If you want to know more about the SSON Research and Analytics and the Metrics Intelligence Hub, email Naomi. That's her email address. You're going to get this slide deck as well, so you'll be able to see it there. If you're not sure, send me an email. I can point you to her. If you want to get access to the end-to-end process playbook, email Harvey at that email address. Again, you can get hold of us either way. So hopefully you found that useful. We've got a couple of questions. We've got 2 minutes to go. So a couple of questions here. What have we got? So, right, leading and lagging indicators. How do we find the right balance between them? Right. Steve, do you want to say a few words about that?
Yeah, and I think, Dan, you alluded to it earlier, right? This idea of, if you focus on defects, classic, those that are leading, and I always kind of looked at that for my processes. I was looking at 4 key metrics, 4 key priorities I wanted to drive some activity around. And if 3 of those were leading, then I thought I was hitting the mark. And maybe the one lagging would be kind of more of a macro metric where the leading kind of fed into that. As we talked about cycle time, or talked about DPO or DSO, right, or days to close. So I think that kind of 3-to-1 ratio works well. But the focus is always on, let's start with the defects and see what the impact was on more of the macro metric that we were looking to really drive visibility to.
That's great. So if your stakeholders tell you what good looks like is X, they give you one big outcome, that's your lagging indicator, then you want to find those 3 leading indicators that will help you get better at that. Got another question here, which is, how often are the benchmarks or the metrics you have shown, how often are they updated? Naomi?
We update them quarterly, and we also do the top 20 most admired shared services study once a year. And you're also able to, as a subscriber, suggest new metrics you'd like to track. So in addition to updating the metrics, we add 8 to 10 new ones every quarter. And something we didn't have time to show today, though, is the ability to actually create your own customizable benchmarking report by inputting your own value into the system and getting a result. So thanks for that question.
That's great. Well, thank you, Naomi. Thank you, Steve. And thank you for all your questions. There's a few more we'll respond to by email. Our 45 minutes is up, and for once in my life, I'm on time. So thank you all for keeping me honest there. I hope you found it useful, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you all.